But yeah, some people really don't want their information out there and they have a very negative response. They get upset behind it. So how are we going to manage these technologies where we're trying to develop emotions in robots, where we're trying to understand how people respond to various types of technology? And I think it's going to get more and more complicated. Now we have all this data. And as you know, with the data, that's again another way that they're using technologies to capture data, whether it's through facial recognition systems. And as most people heard, I hope that it doesn't, with facial recognition, sometimes it can't capture people that have darker skin. So that's the whole film Coded Bias is about that. So we have to start looking at some of these aspects of technology and what it means with the technology that leaves people out, that causes these emotional responses to various aspects of it, where people reject the fact that what these technologies are doing, or people see that technologies, some people still say Big Brother is watching. So there's all these emotional responses to Big Brother watching. There are these emotional responses to how individuals may see themselves within these spaces. So there's a lot going on with technology, and the types of technologies that we build that either humanize us more or dehumanize us. And that's been around for a long time. So it's nothing new. It's just different types of technologies. And another example would be film. Movies have always evoked emotions with human beings. And they have music, even background music, to create those emotional responses when you're watching a film or a video. I don't know if most people notice that when they're in the theater and they're watching a film, the kind of music that's playing, and paying attention to the music to see how the music controls emotions. So I think we have a big challenge ahead of us in terms of emotions and technology. And it's all around us. We can say it's literally omnipresent. It really is, in terms of even how we're engaging with each other right now. What are the emotional responses that we're getting from the audience or the other members of the panel, and how they're responding to this technology mediated space? What does it mean? Are they responding to the people in there? Or does the space actually interfere or encourage in some way the kind of emotional response that we're having? When you look at our backgrounds, another type of technology, how are we responding to the background? We were talking earlier about the space that I'm in. This is a happy space for me, and that's why I have it as my background. And it makes me feel good when I see this. So all these things have an effect on us one way or the other in terms of how we respond to these various technologies. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sharon. There's a lot of food for thought here. I'd love to be able to ask you some questions myself already, but we're going to move on to the artists in the programme. So I'm very excited to now invite Rod and Nathan to present their very unique response to the downloadable brain themes. I've now had the pleasure of meeting with Rod a number of times online, discussing our mutual interests of the relationship between technology and humans, but through neurological experience. And the history of science and technology and the transformation of the body, it tells a really interesting story, because it follows this trajectory that has moved from desktop computing, mobile computing, to wearables, and then finally BCI systems, which literally directly pick up your neural activity. And each iteration opens a new pathway for sharing one's inner self more intimately, and as Rod seeks to explore more invasively. So in the preceding months, I've been really excited to see Rod put together the most amazing team of collaborators and inventors, one of whom is with us today. And I've watched the progression of his project on the edge of my seat, because it's really exciting. And I'm really delighted to share with you the intriguing results of this innovative experiment. So now I welcome Rod and Nathan to the stage.
Great, thanks, Gabriella. Hoping that I'm everyone can hear me okay. So I'm just going to do a quick intro to the project, and then hand over to Nathan, and he's going to do a quick intro to sort of his role in the project and his kind of take on it. So the artwork's called Machine in the Middle, and it's an exploration of our relationship to machines, and particularly the way that we integrate with them, or perhaps they integrate with us. And it kind of builds on a long-standing interest that I've had in behaviorism and cybernetics. And this project was made with Nathan Semertzidis, who is based in Melbourne in the Exertion Games Lab, where it's actually the middle of the night. So we're really grateful for Nathan to kind of missing out on a night's sleep, basically, to be with us. And Machine in the Middle is both an artwork, but it's also a functioning technical prototype. So you're about to see a film that sort of documents the artwork and the technical prototype, and you can sort of think of the film as a demo of an operational system, and it focuses on the quantification of moods or emotions, which of course has a really long history from Charles Darwin's expression of the emotions of man, emotional expressions in man and animals, all the way through to sort of Paul Ekman's much more contested and more recent studies of emotional states. But the thing that's really interesting is this kind of fusion between affect and machine, because it feels as if really that is like the last frontier of an increasingly intimate integration with machines that we are having, and as they sort of quite literally move into our bodies and minds. And so exactly as Gabriella's just described, you know, we've kind of moved from desktop computers to mobiles we take everywhere, to wearables that biosensor us. It almost seems as if the machines now know more about us than we know about ourselves. And so we might sort of speculate then that calculating our emotional state from biosensing is really like the next logical step in this trajectory, and not without its problems, actually. And so what fascinates me really is the way in which this kind of calculable system that can maybe make some assessment or prediction about our mood relies on a mathematical vision of behavior. And in our project, our code quite literally calculates emotional states. And this, of course, is actually really reminiscent of the way that Shoshana Zuboff describes how every human aspect and every human action, every aspect of human life is quantified through our digital interfaces and devices. So this kind of naturally then prompts questions really about what kind of agency will humans and machines have together, and what kind of new assemblages will arise from that kind of increasing exchange and intimacy. A Machine in the Middle proposes really quite a specific vision of this. And because it's based essentially on a cyber attack, or a particular type of cyber attack called a man-in-the-middle attack or a machine-in-the-middle attack. And usually a man-in-the-middle cyber attack involves an attacker who secretly intercepts the electronic communication between two parties, you know, maybe who are emailing together or electronically communicating in some way. In this case, the two parties are the brain and the face of a single person, and that person is the world snooker champion Steve Davis. And the machine in the middle is the EEG control system and the machine learning system that Nathan and I have built, that controls the communication between Steve's emotional state and his facial expression, as you'll see in a moment. And Steve is our really perfect subject because he was very famous for his deadpan demeanor and famous for never openly expressing any emotion during snooker tournaments. Okay, so now I'm going to hand over to Nathan, who's going to tell you a little bit about his research before we watch the film.
Thanks, Rod, and thank you everyone for having me here today. So my name's Nathan. I'm a neurotechnologist and HCI researcher. So for those unfamiliar with HCI, it's essentially a multidisciplinary area of research which overlaps with computer science, design, and psychology, mainly concerned with how humans and computers interact. And I'm also part of a body of researchers in HCI driving forward what we believe is a new paradigm shift within HCI called human-computer integration. So it's no longer sufficient to describe the relationship between humans and computers as interaction, but rather what we see suggests that we're now in a relationship with between humans and computers of integration. So this is a distinction brought on by the advent of machines which can act with agency, and human-computer assemblages which can bidirectionally act on each other. So this is contrast to what we had seen previously, in which a human would give a command and the machine would respond. And so we're beginning to see computers integrate with humans on a societal level, such as things like virtual assistants and other AI-powered systems, which are becoming increasingly parts of our lives. But we're also beginning to see technology integrate with the human on a bodily level. So through time, as we've said a few times now, so we've gone from mainframes to personal desktops to portable notebooks, pocketed smart devices, wearables. So in each step, the technology is becoming ever closer to the human body. And we're now even beginning to see instances in which the human and the machine overlap, in which systems borrow parts of the user's body for input and output, and instances in where the human and machine come together almost as a symbiotic organism. And so this notion is what led me to cross paths with Rod and ultimately collaborate on this piece together. So through my research, I design, develop, and evaluate brain-computer interfaces from a human-computer integration perspective. So to better understand how future technology can facilitate the merger of the human brain with artificial intelligence. And I believe this work with Rod and myself that we've collaborated on has brought us closer to understanding the future of the integration between humans and computers through the exploration of these feedback loops that we've created between the brain and the muscle, facilitated by technology. So I hope this helps us all here consider, for better or for worse, the path that we're leading towards collectively as a species and the implications it poses. And I guess I'll pass it back to Rod or Gabriella.
Thank you, that's great. I'm just going to share my screen now so that we can watch the video from the start.
This is Steve. Steve is listening to music. What is he feeling? We don't know what Steve feels unless he directly changes his facial expression. We have placed 8 blue electrodes across the front of Steve's head. The electrodes record Steve's electroencephalographic data. The electrodes are now capturing data from Steve's brain as it pulses and senses the changes in rhythm and music. Watch as he thinks and feels. We are wirelessly streaming, in real time, the firing rate from thousands of neurons from Steve's brain. A computer acquires the data in batches every few seconds. The data is cleaned of environmental noise. It is passed to an algorithm that has been previously trained on emotional brain activity. What can it do? The algorithm can recognize when Steve experiences a pleasant feeling and when he experiences an energetic feeling. Steve may not directly communicate what he is feeling, but I can make a good prediction about his mood. The algorithm is now predicting his emotional reaction, and we will change his facial expression to match his feelings. We are showing Steve clips of video footage. Each clip is different. See Steve as he reacts. Let's watch as his brain processes each clip. How will he feel? Steve is feeling happy. His brain is aroused and energetic. His feelings are positively charged. I will now change Steve's face to match his mood. This is how his face looks as I push electrical pulses into it. His brain is now aroused and energetic, but negatively charged. We might say he is stressed. See how his lips curl. As we mobilize Steve's face, we adjust his expression and decrypt his feelings. Everything that was once hidden is now revealed.
Okay, I think I'm back off screen share. Thank you so much for sharing this wonderful artwork. I am now going to pass the limelight to Sharon to see if she's got any questions to ask Rod and Nathan.
Thank you. You know, as when I look at that, and I have to be honest, I do have quite a few questions. Just why, I heard what you said about why Steve was chosen to participate. Do you have any others that you've also basically conducted this type of research with?
So I mean, with this artwork, really, it was just about trying to make a system, a prototype that was operational. I mean, I think, and then demo it, make a film to demo it. So the idea with this piece is not really to make something that is, it could be kind of rolled out in any sort of useful way. That wasn't, it's more like a kind of, it's more like a philosophical provocation, really. And trying to kind of create a paradigm for a way that we might think about our relationship with machines, hence using the idea of the machine in the middle. I mean, in a way, we all have machines in the middle. Actually, we all have machines between our brains and our behavior now. This is just a very, I guess, quite an extreme way of illustrating that. I don't know if Nathan wants to come in there.
Yeah, sure. So I think when I showed this to my supervisor, actually, he really wanted me to push to try to turn this into like almost a scientific study in some degree. So yeah, as Rod said, it's more of a piece of philosophical provocation to have us think about these things. But definitely, I think we can also. It could also change directions, and we could also take these things toward a more scientific study as well, as the opportunity is open.
Okay, well, okay, which leads me to a second question. Why machine in the middle? Because humans are machines. We are basically organic machines, right? And how do you separate organic from inorganic machines? Because they all are, every aspect of that, even the EEGs that are part of it, and then, you know, the feedback that you get, the results, all of this, if you look at behaviors in general, in terms of how the machines behave compared to how humans behave, what are some of the similarities, and why is the machine in the middle and not necessarily which machine, let me ask you, when you think about it, which machine is in the middle? And could you explain that to me?
So I think the first thing to say is that you know, obviously the idea of the machine in the middle is a definite, you know, it's a very clear reference to the idea of a cyber attack. So to frame the idea of our relationship with technology as an attack in some way. So it works in that respect. But then also, of course, there's a lot of debate actually about the kind of interrelationship between machines and humans, and whether it's possible really to frame human behavior and human actions within a kind of technological, mathematical formulation. And you know, and I'm kind of, I'm very, very interested in the history of in kind of the development of information science, and particularly in cybernetics. And I'm very interested in Norbert Wiener's original formulation, actually, of the relationship between humans and machines in his book, The Human Use of Human Beings, in which he, you know, he kind of says that in order for us to have a kind of meaningful relationship with machines, it's pretty much going to have to be on the machine's terms, because the machines are just simply not clever enough to be able to manage the inverse situation where the relationship with the machine would be on the human terms. So the human behavior needs to be reduced to a calculable form that a machine can process and understand. And it seems that that's actually the model of technology that we now really live with, and this is what Machine in the Middle tries in a way to kind of flesh out. So, but I think that, you know, Nathan, I'd hand over to Nathan as well, because I'm sure he's got another take on this.
Yeah, thank you. So that latter point you touched on, I think I'll just address it now while it's fresh in my mind. So yeah, meeting the machine on the machine's terms. More recently, there was a computer scientist named, I think, Mark Weiser, who said that computing should be like a refreshing walk in the woods, and that, he said that rather than try to meet the machine on the machine's terms, we should bring the machine out to the human world. And I think, well, we're definitely becoming more machine in dealing with our machines. I think the machines are also becoming a lot like us. And I think that is sort of illustrated a lot in the current state of HCI research. So in a lot of HCI research, that like the current paradigms that we're moving into now in conceptualizing the relationships between humans and machines, it's sort of we're sort of looking at it as though it's more of a flat ontology. So we sort of emphasize the importance to look at them both as similar objects, not as different. So a lot of new theories that are coming out of the HCI are trying to avoid distinguishing between the human and the machine. And there are proponents like against this as well, saying like it dehumanizes us. And some people are saying that's probably a good thing, because there are problems with humanism, particularly damaging towards, you know, like the environment, and like it being an incomplete philosophy as well. And so a lot of people are advocating for post-humanism as well. And I think this also converges with a lot of contemporary neuroscience research, which like especially things like integrated information theory, which kind of propose that like all things are kind of imbued with consciousness to some degree. It's almost animistic, and that like consciousness actually arises from how integrated those assemblages of, you know, molecules and stuff actually are, and the information flows in them. So to your point, which one is the machine? I'd say it's very dependent. Yeah, it's just a point of reference. I would very much agree that there is perhaps no real difference.
Yes, thank you so much. I really appreciate that response, because I do think that it is a type of integration emerging when you look at, you know, machines as extensions. That's why, you know, now I guess people are calling individuals cyborgs. I mean, we know that's been around for a while. I'd like to now go to the audience and actually read a few questions from the audience. One of them from M. McCarthy. She says, Rod, your work is steeped in history and previous innovation. What's the oldest model you were thinking about when working on this project?
I'm not sure what I guess, yeah, I guess maybe more in terms of hypothesis, maybe is a better way of framing it. So it really was actually the very original ideas that Wiener had about cybernetics, which is a thing I kind of go back to time and time again, really. And I'm always very interested to see how they map against our contemporary moment. And in some ways this piece was sort of about trying to do that, because of course what Nathan and I did is create a kind of a feedback loop between the brain, the machine learning system, and the electrical muscle stimulation on Steve's face. So in some ways it bears quite a close relationship to Wiener's original model hypothesis for his anti-aircraft predictor. And it is, I guess, loosely based around that in some ways.
Well, thank you so much, Rob. Nathan, I have a question for you by Michelle Henning. Were you disappointed with Steve's face when it did not contort more and look more like the Victorian photographs of people being stimulated by electric shocks?
That's pretty funny. I was actually, because I wasn't actually there during the filming. I didn't actually get to see this firsthand, so I've only seen what you guys have seen in the video, being here in Australia. Although I was actually very impressed with how much his face contorted, to be honest. I've never seen EMS done on a face before, and I was like, yeah, especially when he did the initial smile, I was like, wow, oh my god, it works. Like, yeah, so perhaps not, yeah, definitely not disappointed. I was very excited.
Thank you. Another question is, anyone on the panel, could you talk a little bit about the design and development and fabrication of the machine? Although for me, I'm not sure which machine is being referenced here, but you guys, please, I guess this Radley Cook maybe speak about the machine in the middle. I don't know.
But maybe we could also, maybe in answering that, also answer Andre's question as well about collecting data, because that's kind of part of the system. And I just want to flag up actually that Andre is the creator of BrainFlow, which is basically the software system that our scripts are built upon. So, you know, shout out to Andre really for making BrainFlow, and also for helping us as well, actually, do something pretty crazy. Although he's done some pretty, you know, BrainFlow is a pretty crazy thing. So, so really what happens is the way that this works is that the EEG signals are collected by the electrodes and sent by Bluetooth to my laptop. And then from my laptop, they are processed using a machine learning model that Nathan trained on a data set from Loughborough University. Maybe he can talk a little bit more about that bit of it in a moment. And then from that, a classification is made, which is a kind of 2-point classification. And again, I'm going to let Nathan describe that in just a moment. And that we then kind of make a plot, which is kind of rudimentary plot about the emotional state of the subject. And then that's sent to an Arduino, which is a microcontroller, which is connected to relays and electrical muscle stimulation pads, and activates various different electrical muscle stimulation pads, depending on EMS pads, depending on which emotional state is being experienced. And there were 4 that we kind of mapped, basically, and you saw 2 in the film. So I'll hand up to Nathan now, because he can talk a little more about the engineering system behind it.
Yeah, I can talk about the classification. So the classification is dependent on 2 main parameters, and that's valence and arousal. So valence being like how good the emotion is feeling, and arousal being like how the degree of energy the emotion can be described to have. And so for the metric of arousal, Andrea actually used your classifier for relaxation and normalized it, and then inversed the result. And yeah, so that was actually a good metric for arousal. And then for valence, I trained a support vector machine on the phase spectral density, the power spectral density, sorry, of the LUMED emotion dataset, which is just a publicly available dataset of different emotional reactions to different stimuli. And then in combining those 2 metrics together, you get a pretty good classification of 4 different emotional states, essentially.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to interject now. Some really interesting questions, both from Sharon and also the audience members. So thanks everyone for chiming in. I think we're going to move on to the next artwork now, which is the new Herulians, published today. So the new Herulians is quite close to my heart, and I've been developing it with Marcos Lutyens for around a year now. And basically it's an immersive participatory artwork taking viewers on a journey through space and time through a 10-minute engagement of emotion, memory, and storytelling. So participants, they're invited to listen to a hypnotic sci-fi narrative, which is a parody of the technological world that we live in today. And the experience is very private and personal and unique to the listener, as it's very much impacted by the setting and the unique location that you choose to experience the artwork within. So as I said before, the origins of the New Herulians date right back to kind of the height of lockdown, really, last spring. And Marcos and I began collaborating for the artwork's first trial, I guess, at Athens Digital Arts Festival. And at the time we were locked down, we were locked into the confines of our home, or at least our local parks, and we're experiencing this global shift in our understanding and our relationship with the physical and also virtual environment. So really we wanted to create an experience that would draw upon this unusual nature of place at the time. And the result was an artwork that follows you. It connects with you emotionally, environmentally and cognitively through this story of the lost tribe from ancient Athens who stole the city's most precious relic, the magic sphere of Helios. And then as the project progressed this year, we've been really lucky to work with the Liverpool John Moores MA Art and Science students who have helped us bring the artwork to its full potential. So I'm going to hand over the limelight to Marcos now so he can share with you some of his thoughts behind the artwork.
Thank you, Gabriella. That's a fantastic introduction. And so I'm just going to share my screen a moment. There we go. So here we are. Hopefully you can see this sphere. What we were interested in was the understanding of place, and also understanding place in terms of intuition and feelings versus kind of more rational, logical ways of understanding of place. We were also interested in this aspect of time and how time extends through space, and on the external part of our understanding as a kind of scenery changes over time, but also internally, perhaps relating to the polyvagal nerve theory, which is that there are different types of nervous systems going out throughout our body that incorporate a kind of evolutionary understanding of change in time. And also within this experimentation is, does technology help or hinder this understanding of the world around us? So I guess this kind of riffs on the past project that we've been looking at is, does technology hinder or help how we see things? In terms of the past project that we just saw, which is pretty amazing, it kind of gives you the creeps, but at the same time, you could also imagine that it could be used for stroke patients to help them kind of them remember how their muscles move. So in certain ways, it can be positive or negative. The idea of the New Herulians, the title, comes from this aspect of a tribe from the north of Europe that invaded ancient Greece, and it sacked Athens. And in that sacking, there was obviously a kind of revolution. And I suppose you can see in the image on the left, it says barbarian Europa. And the Herulians always got a kind of bad rap for breaking down civilization. But I think sometimes in breaking down civilization, it actually helps other things come to light. And on the right image, I guess we've got a picture of some kind of symbiotic AI universe. And I think a lot of us feel, perhaps threatened by this new singularity that's taking over and where that will go. But the jury's out. So this is a speculative project that works on those ideas. This is the original sphere, not the sphere that the Herulians took into their own kind of planetary system. It's a very curious object, and it was discovered buried near the Acropolis in Athens. And it has a lot of kind of sigils and diagrams on it. So it's not really a sculpture. It's actually one of the only objects in the whole Acropolis Museum that's not an artwork in itself. It's more kind of divinatory mechanism. And for instance, you can see those circles. They were to do with ether, earth, water, fire, and air. So some kind of linkage to the environment in a way. So it's a kind of old machine, I guess you could say. Going back to 2003, I've been working on this issue of understanding space from an emotional context for a while. I worked with 30 engineers in Cagliari, which is in Italy, and we wanted to chart, how people's responses would be to different parts of the city, to kind of public spaces, private spaces, parks, and other places. And we wanted to chart it from emotional aspects. There was sensing and feeling on one side. Sorry, intuition and feelings on one side, which is a kind of more fuzzy way of understanding reality, and also sensing and thinking, which is a kind of more rational, logical way of understanding reality. And then we also put in this vector of present and future. Do we kind of consider a place that kind of makes us feel and think about the past, or does it make us kind of anticipate the future? And so we tried to start to map these emotions, and you can actually begin to see the blobs. I was looking at the project for the first time in a while yesterday to make this slideshow, and I was actually surprised to see that the sphere of Helios was already beginning to take form. And these blobs were a way of kind of mapping these kind of emotional states that are kind of fuzzy states. They can't be pinpointed, but they kind of give a kind of feeling of where you might be in accordance to a specific place in the city. The engineers were listening to an audio induction, a bit like what we're presenting here. And back in the day, technology wasn't as advanced, so we were using kind of spreadsheets and mapping in a kind of more analog way, but trying to kind of extract data from people's responses to different locations. And we set up a kind of interactive map, a kind of pretty primitive interactive emotional map with some servos that would deflect a flat membrane up and down depending on people's emotional responses to different parts of the city. So if in general the 30 students had a good experience in one part of the city, this kind of map plane would extrude upwards, and if they had a negative experience, the map plane would extrude downwards. Kind of thinking about how a map, you kind of usually look at a map on a screen or on a piece of paper and it's flat, but if you could put emotions into that, you'd have an immediate feeling of where in a city or in a landscape good emotions could be found. So you may head off that way. And so here it is. We've made the app. We've perfected the app somewhat. It's still work in progress. And Rafael Ara was very key in getting the app to where it is. And we'd love for you to try it out. And I would prefer not to explain too much about the app so that so it's fresh in your minds when you encounter it. Gabriella, do you have anything else to say?
No, I think you've highlighted it really nicely, and I think, as you said, you kind of don't really want to give too much away before people have experienced it themselves. So maybe let's see what Sharon is making of this experience, and perhaps more of the research will come out as we talk.
Well, thank you, Gabriella, and thank you so much, Marcos. I thought it was absolutely beautiful. For me, the way I even experienced it, and I'm not going to talk about my experience with the actually app because other people have to do that, but I will say just your presentation, for me, put me in a very calm emotional space. And of course, everyone would have a different experience with that. So can you tell me what else were you expecting from this actually this piece in terms of emotions, looking at how people responded in these different spaces. And did it matter who the individual was? Because a lot of times, did you see a pattern at all with the way people interacted or reacted?
Well, I think that the jury's out, and what I like about working in the context of art is a kind of emergent vector from the general public back into the artwork. So the general public makes the artwork, as opposed to the usual paradigm of an artist who like creates an object and then it's up to the public to just absorb it, whether they want to or not. I did a project actually in Birmingham. There was 6 architecture groups that were working on redesigning a certain part of Birmingham. And so in that particular case, I was working with them in a kind of similar mode. And what we were trying to do was engage their kind of unconscious response to a city and the city design. And so I suppose in that particular case, there was a kind of a very applied and practical approach, and also hopefully an outcome, because in my opinion, the way we kind of design cities around us is often based on codes and rules and regulations, some of them which may make sense, but over time it kind of creates this kind of constraint, and you forget about the kind of emotive engagement of how you deal with a space. I'm also actually working on a project with some architects and engineers in San Luis Obispo, which is close to where you are. And we've been working on a design project, and it's amazing how in the teaching of architecture and even more in engineering, how the kind of emotive aspect of dealing with space is completely disregarded. It's all just about form and how form, works within a certain space and fits certain codes. So anyway, it's a work in progress for sure.
It's interesting, Marcus, that you mentioned how your architectural students aren't considering emotion within architecture, because I originally studied architecture as my undergraduate degree before I became curator. And for me, that was how I became a curator, because I think I was more interested in the internal space of a building than the external, and how a space could have a real psychological impact on a person's journey and on their experience of the space. So for me, it's really interesting, because I think my interest in psychology stemmed from my architecture degree. But going back to your question, Sharon, about did we find anything surprising about people's emotional reactions? So at this point, not many people have tried out the artworks. We only released it today, but we were lucky enough to kind of run it with some students from LGMU, as I mentioned earlier on. And I loved hearing all of their different responses and their different reactions, and actually learning about how much place had an impact on how they were feeling at the time. I think we talked about how different times of the day can have an impact on your emotions. I mean, me personally, I love to go outdoors and go for a walk at dawn or dusk, and talking about different like other kind of variables, like if you're in a busy place or if you're in a place of nature. And from a personal perspective, I would always say to people, go to nature, go and experience this alone, and it's a really meditative experience. But then some people reported they much preferred doing it at home, maybe in their own private environment. So I really do think it's quite unique to the individual.
You raised a really good point. It made me think about I don't know, probably in 2005. I used to teach inside Second Life. And one of the things that what I found out that my students, they really wanted to be outside. We started out in a castle, believe it or not. That's where we would engage in these different conversations. And then they finally settled on the fact that they wanted to be outside. They wanted to be with nature. And I think that nature does something to us emotionally as well as being confined. When you think about being in a closed space, and even within building structures, because many buildings are built, as you mentioned, Marcos, without even the consideration of emotional reactions and responses. So I wonder, you know, what does that do to the mind? Does it make you a prisoner in your own mind when you're in these spaces like this? Whereas when you're outside, your mind opens up and you can experience it. And I really would like to hear more about that, even from other members of the panel, in terms of what Marcos has done with these different spaces. So, because this is really exciting to me, and it does definitely allow me not to be a prisoner in my own mind in many ways.
Is there any comment maybe from Rod or Nathan just on, I mean, you're both now experts of emotions. Have you thought much about, the impact of space on emotions, and has that impacted your work at all?
I guess I can talk about this because this is actually a significant portion of my thesis. So that map, Marcos, that you were showing, is I've actually talked a lot about doing the potential for doing something like that with like emotion recognition through EEG, like as people walk around the city to map out you know, places of different emotional content. And like I did a project previously before this called Neo Numina, in which similar to this, like you wear an EEG headset, and you can it visualizes the wearer's emotion in an augmented reality. So if you look at that person in augmented reality, you can see like an aura of emotional content around them. And I think that one of the most interesting finding was that was like how the emotion of the person was interpreted depending on the space that they were in and what kind of things they were doing in that space. It sort of like had extra information in that. So they were like inside a house and they were playing cards, you know, another person would use that to interpret, perhaps like work out what cards they had in the card game and whether they had a good hand or not. And so, yeah, I've been thinking like it would be good to explore how that could, that relation in space can be further extrapolated, and think like, you know, maybe we could do some really weird kind of like ant pheromone / Yelp review thing in which, you know, how good everything is based on everyone's emotional content in space.
I think one of the other things as well is that when certainly my experience of testing our system that Nathan and I built was that you start to wonder about your own sense of yourself as well, and that actually your own sense of yourself becomes slightly fuzzy, or slightly you feel slightly ambiguous about it, and you're not, you know, the machine is maybe suggesting that you're feeling in a certain way, and that almost becomes like a kind of suggestive prompt, perhaps, that, oh, am I actually feeling like this? And you suddenly have this kind of idea that there's a weird kind of feedback loop that happens. And also there's a sort of sense in which actually perhaps you even feel less connected to your feelings, actually, generally. So, and I kind of wonder, actually, if obviously I did this pretty much sitting in front of a computer screen when I was testing this, but I do wonder, you know, if I'd actually been able to disassociate myself from the computer screen and walk around and be in another environment, actually whether I might have had a very different kind of experience, actually, and whether it's very hard to kind of map that then against the kind of results actually that you're getting in sort of real time. But I think that I can imagine that might have had quite a big difference, actually, a different impact.
You know, it really made me think about it. You guys are talking, you know, in many ways, these spaces that we're in, they're manipulating who we are. So, and I know, even though people want to think about, well, we're actually in control of the manipulation, but the thing itself is actually controlling and manipulating. It's like doing, you know, it's clearly an experiment. It's it's a type of experiment that you have to question and say, well, you know, how open can I be, or how can I deal with this, knowing that it is manipulating my emotions in some ways, whether it's the building, Marcos, or the actual technology itself. You know, what happens if it's just empty and there's nothing there? What would someone else create emotionally within that space of emptiness? And Marcos, I'd love to hear from you about that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, this idea, what I'm interested in is particularly is this idea of kind of what I call chronoesthesia. I'm very interested in synaesthesia. I've worked a lot with this phenomenon called synaesthesia, which happens to about 1 in 20 or 200 people, depending on how you look at it. I think we're all synaesthetes, but this idea that there's a kind of sensory crossover in the mind. But I also think that there's this other dimension of time crossovers in the body, and how we interpret the function of time through a different, in the same environment. You know, basically what I'm getting at is this kind of model of the brain, which is that you have the brain stem, you have the limbic system. The brain stem is the kind of most primary part of the brain. Then you have the limbic system, which is maybe the reptilian brain. And then you have, over the top of it, you have the neocortex, which is the kind of most advanced, quote unquote, advanced part of the brain. And so you got like these kind of 3 temporal systems in your brain architecture, and they relate to different responses in time. Let's say the mammalian brain, the reptilian brain, and you know, even kind of before that. And so when you're in a space, whether it's a kind of experimental space, or you're sitting in front of your computer, or you're in your that beautiful library that you have behind you, there's all these interpretations of the space around you through these kind of filters that are happening within your kind of brain machine. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's certainly what's been kind of interesting me.
Great, thank you. I didn't know if Gabriella, you wanted to respond to that as well before I move on to ask a question that's specifically asked of Rod.
I was focusing on the audience questions, so I think it would be safer for you to move on to your next one.
Okay.
And then I'll come to one of the audience questions at the end before we finish.
Okay, thank you. So Rod, Bruce Gilchrist says, biofeedback pioneer Max Cade has recommended combining as many biometric devices together as possible for more meaningful data, EEG plus ESR plus ECG, for example. Any plans to increase interface in this kind of way?
I mean, I'm sure that's right, actually. I'm sure that the more kind of data points that you have, and the more biosensing you can do, the more you're going to be able to construct a kind of meaningful result. And obviously we know as well from the way that all of the digital platforms that we use work is that they kind of don't rely on single data points. That in a way what they're doing is they're kind of profiling you based on, you know, sort of a temporal, you know, kind of temporal span. They're also profiling you based on a range of different responses that you might have online. And I'm sure that exactly the same kind of thing would be true from biosensing as well. But I mean, again, you know, I suspect Nathan may have done this actually. So Nathan may well have already done this.
Yeah, I've actually read like lots of papers in my field that have done that previously. And it's always reliably like, yeah, the more sensors you have, the more complete information you have on the visual, the more accurate your classification is.
I think also another follow-up to that, I remember reading also about how emotional AI technology at the moment is quite young, and so there are lots of startups that are using it, but as you said, they only use, say, one biometric device, which makes it a lot less accurate. But as a result, it means that it's much more susceptible to bias because the emotional data isn't so accurate. And so one of the things that I read to avoid bias within emotional AI is to integrate more than one type of emotional feedback. I was wondering if anyone from the panel, or maybe from Sharon as well, had anything to say about bias in emotional AI.
I welcome anyone, but it is laden with bias. And I think that we have to understand anything that we build or develop is from a particular perspective. And it's difficult if you don't have individuals from infinite perspective, I hate to put it like that, involved, then you're definitely going to have some bias in the system. It's just unavoidable. I mean, and I have to say this, as a Black woman, there has been a lot of bias and a lot of discussion. One of my former students, of course, Sophia Noble, wrote a book on algorithms of oppression and looking at the algorithmic bias. So bias is built into any system because it comes from an individual's or a few individuals' perspectives. And I think that there's been a lot of backlash behind it. And I mentioned earlier coded bias, and of course there's all type of bias built into algorithms because you have these individuals that are in a cultural context that bring their own perspectives and culture into the system. And I think that we have to start looking more at that because people don't think about it. I mean, something as simple as looking at how women are categorized or what happens with these algorithms. And Google has found all types of bias. We know the recent story of someone getting fired behind some of the algorithmic bias. So it's a problem. It's a big problem. And often women are not involved in it as well. So it's a racial as well as a gendered kind of bias. And we live in a gendered bias system. We're now coming to understand things like non-binary and things like that. But at the same time, there is a lot of bias that are involved in AI algorithms.
I think it's also good to just dive into that a little bit as well and try and disentangle it. One of the ways in which that bias happens is through the data sets that are used in the machine learning systems, and obviously the very famous case of ImageNet, which is one of the biggest and most well-used data sets, having incredible kind of gender stereotypes embedded in it. And it also, of course, using images of people like without their consent and so on. So bias happens in that respect. In the machine system is only as good as the data set that it's trained upon, and if that data set, which of course has also been labeled and assembled by humans, in a way the craft, perhaps you could say, of contemporary AI systems is actually in creating the data set, rather than necessarily than writing the code that actually then either trains the data set or interrogates it. So I think that's one thing really to focus on. And the other thing as well is to think about, what purpose that the machine learning system is being put to use on, and who is it that's programming it, and what its function is, who's commissioning it, basically, and what its purpose is. Because obviously what its purpose is as well, to some degree, is going to then determine what kind of data sets are required. So then certain things will be selected to be created into data sets and other things will not. So bias will happen in that respect as well, almost through like a kind of commissioning structural architectural information architectural process, as well as through the actual selection of the data itself. And it's just worth just mentioning as well that in our project, actually, the data set is really tiny. It's only 13. There was only 13 subjects in our data set. It's actually very hard to find good data sets for kind of emotional responses using EEG. There aren't that many of them around, and they were mixed gender actually. But obviously with only 13, a sample of 13, that's very, very, very small, really. I don't know, maybe Nathan has some more experience with this.
Yeah, no, like pretty much everything that you just said. Yeah, so the data set that we used to train the model, of course, was collected by researchers and labeled into different emotional categories based on what they perceive to be different emotional categories, based on certain videos which they perceive to have different emotional weightings or not, which were verified by the participants, which also had, you know, their own interpretation of what the different emotional categories meant. So there was just like many inception layers of bias going into the creation of that data set. And then there's the factor that like everyone's brain is different as well. So what would accurately, you know, detect some emotional state in one person's brain? Like, although machine learning does account for variance, you're not going to be able to generalize it perfectly across all people. And so, like, to combat that, some people have suggested making like BCI systems or EEG systems that kind of learn to interpret the user as the user learns to use the device, although that's obviously very hard to engineer. But yeah, I guess like I think when you're dealing with biometric data, like it's very easy to believe that it's an objective like seer of truth, but like in all honesty, there's no way to like extract absolute truth from like quantified biometrics. It's yeah. Sometimes it's better to just ask people how they feel.
I mean, I think that's the other interesting thing about working on this project as well. I've worked on a couple of machine vision projects, and the difference is that obviously you can kind of quantify, you know, what a table looks like, what a cat looks like. But if someone's feeling sad, that's a much harder thing to quantify. And so one person labeling something as sad, another person labeling something as sad, maybe actually an entirely different kind of EEG, an entirely different EEG range.
Thank you, everyone. I'm just going to interject now. We're just coming to the end of the event. So Sharon, did you want to say anything to close off before I say goodbye and some follow-ups about future events?
Yeah, I think I would, you know, because I really appreciate the multiple perspectives. And this is what we need more, multiple perspectives that are not just grounded within a dichotomy. Looking more at how do we be more inclusive within these spaces, and what will others bring to the space that will enable us to be less biased, although we will always have some bias built into it. So I think that's something that we have to think about is how do we get there? How do we get there to these multiple spaces that are more inclusive and less biased, and not just based on a dichotomy? So that's what I would have to. That's
Thanks so much for co-hosting as well, Sharon. It's been absolutely fantastic having you here and having your perspective as well, from someone who's much more of an expert than me. So everyone, thank you so much for attending, and to all of the wonderful panel. It's been such an interesting discussion. I've written in my notepad so many different notes, and I'm really excited to write an article to try and capture some of the wise words that have been said tonight. So if any of you are new to Cognitive Sensations tonight and you've never visited our website, please look it up. We've got all sorts of interesting things that are related to today's event, and also part of the wider program, The Downloadable Brain. We have 2 events left, one virtual and one in real life. Can you believe it? So the next event will be an augmented reality exhibition, which either you can attend in real life on the 15th of July in Liverpool, so it's for local people only, or you can also request an exhibition pack, because we've curated this exhibition so that anyone can take part in this exhibition, and we want to get audience members off their seat, stop looking at digital art through their computers, and again out into nature. And we'll be sending you different prompts which you can place in any place of your choice, and then augment them with a special app which we have developed. And then finally, our closing event will be a neurocinematic film, The Moment, which I really encourage people to book tickets for, because it's very exciting, by Richard Rumcham. So I'm going to finish now. So thank you everyone again. We will be uploading this recording at some point if you have missed any part of the event. So yeah, thank you and good night.